we move on to Richard Graves, a descendant of Richard Percival, who lived in the valley. And well, I don't want to take anything more from this talk. I'll explain the...
Yes, thank you, Bill. I've been asked to talk to you all about the Percevals of Gordano Valley. Now, I usually introduce myself simply as Richard Graves. It's by this name that I'm known in the business community within Bristol, where at the age of 73, I still work for 3 mornings a week as financial director of my son's marketing company. There he is, sitting over there. GWS Media Limited. And by the way, as a good businessman, I have plenty of business cards in my pocket should anyone be interested. I'm also a professional author, and I've published a number of biographies, mainly of literary folk. I've written about T. Lawrence of Arabia, the author of 7 Pillars of Wisdom, about John Cooper Powys, author of Glastonbury Romance, said by Margaret Drabble to be the great novel of the 20th century, about his brothers Theodore, chiefly remembered for Mr. Weston's Good Wine, and Llewellyn, an essayist whose work profoundly influenced Philip Larkin. Also about Richard Hughes of a High Wind in Jamaica fame, who worked for the Admiralty during the war and was one of the brains behind the D-Day landings, and a biography in 3 volumes of my late uncle Robert Graves, that remarkable poet who was also the author of a famous war memoir, Goodbye to All That, of the Claudius historical novels, and of that inspired masterpiece about the nature of romantic poetry, The White Goddess. Having learned to read at the age of 4, I was a terrible bookworm, reading 2 books a week during term time and 2 books a day during the holidays. And I always wanted to be a writer, but first in 1968, I embarked on a teaching career in the mistaken belief that teachers had plenty of spare time. 5 years later, in 1973, I began writing full-time. Now, at that time, there were several other men named Richard Graves, 2 of whom appeared regularly in the news of the world, having become briefly notorious for their criminal activities. In order not to be mistaken for one of these villains, I decided that as an author, I would use my full name, Richard Percival Graves. I'll just let this helicopter pass by.
Hopefully they got the wrong Richard Graves. They're off. Let's see.
So I decided that as an author, I would use my full name, Richard Percival Graves. I thus followed the example of my grandfather, an Anglo-Irish poet born in Dublin in July 1846 and named Alfred Percival Graves. Now, but why Percival, and why in particular Percival spelt with 2 E's? Gosh, that's given me so much trouble through my life explaining that to people. My family had always been very proud of the fact that back in 1880, oh, it's not coming back again, is it? It is. Oh dear, oh dear. Does this happen often? Only when I'm giving a talk. Right. My family had always been proud of the fact that back in 1806, my great-great-grandfather, John Crosby Graves, a distinguished barrister in Dublin, married Helena Percival, a great beauty and a member of one of the most illustrious families in Britain. Helen, of whom I have a fine portrait at home, traced her descent back to a grandfather of William the Conqueror. Another of her ancestors, Robert de Perceval, had fought at William's side at the Battle of Hastings, which was mentioned just now, in 1066, and been rewarded with large tracts of Somerset. In her own time, one of Helena's cousins was the British politician Spencer Perceval, who became Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1807, and as Prime Minister from October 1809, successfully pursued the Peninsular War against Napoleon until he himself was assassinated in the lobby of the House of Commons on the 11th of May 1812. The assassin, John Bellingham, was a merchant with a grievance against the government, but it was only 20 years since the French Revolution had led so many French aristocrats into the cold embrace of Madame Guillotine, and, as I learned from some of Helena's correspondence, preserved in the family for almost 200 years, the government was so frightened that this assassination could spark off an English revolution that they pretended that Bellingham was a madman and saw to it that he was hanged within a week. John Crosbie and Helena lived together in a substantial house at 12 Fitzwilliam Square, which became a literary and musical centre during the 1820s and 1830s, and where they brought up a family of 6 children, the 5th of whom was my grandfather Charles Graves, later the Protestant Bishop of Limerick. From then on, every generation of the family included one or more with Perceval as their middle name. I myself was christened Richard Perceval Graves, and we were all brought up to revere the memory of our Perceval ancestors. From my father, another John, and the genealogist of the family, I learned in particular of Sir Walter Perceval, who in 1346, at the age of 21, was knighted on the field of the Battle of Cressy by King Edward III, and of Richard Perceval, who was said back in 1588 to have deciphered some documents which gave Queen Elizabeth I her first certain intelligence of the Armada. However, I was told nothing about our family connection with Somerset, and even my grandfather, Alfred Perceval Graves, had no idea why John Crosbie's children were sent to Somerset for their early education in the 1820s. And then, on the 25th of May this year, my old friend Bill Shire gave me a tour of the Gordano Valley, during which we visited the church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Weston in Gordano. The excellent guide, which I'm sure many of you have read, written by William King, explains almost a little crossly that it's impossible to delve into the history of Weston and Gordano without coming across the Perceval family. Lords of the manor for centuries, it was the Percevals who built and then rebuilt the church and who dominated the village from their impressive manor house, of which no trace now remains. This church, that I had never before visited, contained not only a bust of my distant cousin Spencer Perceval, but also a stained glass window commissioned by his granddaughters in 1908 and featuring 3 of our Perceval ancestors: Asselin de Perceval, Robert de Perceval's son, who is said to have founded the church back in the 12th century, James Perceval, who added the chapel of St. Mary Magdalene in the 16th century, and Richard de Perceval, who had accompanied King Richard I on the Third Crusade. Oh, the story of Richard de Perceval came as a particular surprise. As a young boy with an interest in history, I shared the then general admiration for Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lionheart, which had been felt for hundreds of years by so many in the English-speaking world. There's a heroic statue of him on horseback, brandishing his sword outside the Houses of Parliament, erected in 1860 on the orders of Prince Albert. And during my childhood in the 1940s and 50s, he was still seen as a great warrior and a great man of God, and Richard was a very popular Christian name as a result. Hardly anybody's called Richard these days. How proud I would have been had I known that I was descended from one of his commanders who survived to return home and tell his story despite being very seriously wounded. Anyway, when I went home myself, I researched in the 2 ancient volumes I possess of Perceval family history published in 1742, and apparently one of the rarest books in the English language. Here, the story of Richard de Perceval's exploits is set out as follows. This Richard was a person of extraordinary valor, and there are a multitude of stories of him and his acts of prowess in that war, delivered down by tradition to our times. It is said that having lost his leg in an engagement in Palestine, he continued, it sounds a bit like that Monty Python thing, doesn't it? He continued yet on horseback till he lost his arm also, and then that he still remained some time in his seat, holding the bridle of his horse in his teeth, in this mangled state, dealing death about him, till he fell by the loss of blood. Outside the church, Bill showed me what remains of his tomb. As the family history explains, his monument was of brass, gilt and very magnificent, but horribly defaced in the late civil wars of 1641 by the Parliament army, who treated everything belonging to this house on those parts without mercy. Thomas Perceval, Esquire, the possessor of the estate, being at that time actively engaged in the quarrel on the contrary side. The remains of this monument are, however, still visible there, and underneath there lies a stone, though somewhat misplaced, with this inscription: Orate pro anima Ricardi Perceval, qui militavit in terra sancta, cum rege Ricardo anno domine MCXC. That is, pray for the soul of Richard Perceval, who fought in the Holy Land with King Richard in the year of our Lord 1190. I myself laid a hand on his tomb and prayed for his soul on that memorable day in May this year. Crusaders are now politically incorrect, but it's facile to judge a 12th century knight by the standards which obtained some 9 centuries after his death. So I choose to be proud of my descent from a warrior described by the Perceval family history as a great commander in the Holy War, this very brave man whose blood still flows in my veins. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We both served on the executive board for the Institute of Directors in Bristol. I've known Richard for years, and he invited me for his 60th birthday celebration.
70th, sorry.
He had a big banqueting hall. It was over 100 people, maybe 200. And on the engraved invitation, said Richard Percival Graves. I've always known him as Richard Graves. So I asked him if there was a family connection with the Richard Percival that we have in our church. And he affirmed that. So that was, when I brought him around to see the grave of his Richard Percival, his eyes actually watered up, and I never thought I'd see that with Richard. But it was a very touching moment.